Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I just want to let everyone know that we have posted the presentation materials for today on our Embodied Carbon website. We will drop a link in the chat. So if you'd like to navigate to our website, you can find the presentation materials for today's webinar there. We're going to get started in just a moment. Thank you very much for your patience.
Hey, maybe we should go ahead and get started. Good morning. I'm Pamela Gupta, the brand chief for Building Decarbonization, and I oversee the Embodied Carbon and Zero Emission Space and Water Heater Program at the California Air Resources Board. I'd like to welcome you all to our second workshop on CARB's work on measuring and reducing embodied carbon in the building sector. Before we get started, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the devastating wildfires that have impacted Los Angeles. Our thoughts are with the families and communities affected by this tragedy. We send our heartfelt support and well wishes to all those who are working tirelessly to rebuild and recover. Once again, thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to receive your feedback and input today on initial concept staff will present. I want to take a moment to introduce some of our team here at CARB that is working on Embodied Carbon program. I'm joined today by two managers, Lex Mitchell and Liang Lu, four presenters, Hanjiro Ambrose, Jeff Kessler, Jeremy Loeb, Emily Gohagan, and also the rest of the Embodied Carbon team. We have a fair amount of content planned for today's workshop. So I'm going to quickly pass the baton over to Dr. Hanjiro Ambrose and our Embodied Carbon program team.
Thank you, Pamela. I'm Hanjiro Ambrose, and I am the lead policy staff working on embodied carbon here at the Air Resources Board. Building on our last workshop, today we will introduce staff concepts on developing a model for estimating baseline greenhouse gas emissions for the state's building sector. We will also hear initial staff thinking on reporting requirements for manufacturers of building materials and covered new construction projects. Today's workshop will be divided into two sessions. In the morning, we will discuss staff concepts for developing a model of baseline greenhouse gas emissions for the state's building sector. The baseline emissions model is a critical element which establishes a reference point for measuring emissions reductions. Following a lunch break, the afternoon session will feature CARB staff's presentations on initial thinking on reporting requirements for manufacturers of building materials and for owners of covered new construction projects. Both the morning and afternoon presentations include ample dedicated time for public feedback. Additionally, we will open a docket for written comments following the workshop. We encourage all interested parties to submit detailed written information once you have had time to more thoroughly review the materials presented today. Before we dive further into our morning presentation, let's take a step back and revisit some of the key concepts presented during our first Embodied Carbon Program workshop. California's climate policies are shaped by state legislation and executive orders, which establish emission reductions targets across multiple sectors. This graph illustrates California's annual greenhouse gas emissions from 2000 to 2020, showing that the state met its 2020 goal of returning to 1990 emissions levels ahead of schedule and has since remained below that threshold. Senate Bill 32 established an emissions target of at least 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, which is also outlined in the 2017 and 2022 scoping plan updates. Looking ahead, Assembly Bill 1279 has set ambitious 2045 targets, an 85% reduction in emissions compared to 1990 levels, and along with achieving carbon neutrality. The 2022 Scoping Plan update provides an actionable plan for how to achieve these ambitious targets. The building sector is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions from the building sector can be categorized into two main types: embodied and operational. Today's workshop focuses on CARB's work to develop a plan for measuring and reporting embodied carbon from the building sector. Embodied carbon refers to the total greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production, transportation, installation, maintenance, and disposal of a material or building over its life cycle. The carbon footprint of a building is due to both embodied and operational emissions. Operational carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the operation and use of a building over its lifetime, such as heating, cooling, or lighting. Embodied carbon is an increasingly significant driver of overall greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector. Thanks to a number of existing programs and new cost-effective technologies, buildings are becoming more efficient. As efficiency gains have helped to shrink greenhouse gas emissions attributed to building operation, the importance of reducing embodied carbon has grown significantly. For example, analysis from the Carbon Leadership Forum, which looked at the embodied and operational greenhouse gas emissions of 30 newly constructed buildings in California, found that in new commercial construction, embodied carbon makes up 46% of total emissions. In new residential construction, embodied carbon can make up to 59% of total emissions. In 2022 and 2023, California passed Assembly Bills 2446 and 43, which directed CARB to reduce emissions from building materials in the state's building sector by 40% based on a 2026 baseline, no later than 2035. Meeting the 40% emissions reductions target for building materials requires addressing embodied carbon at all stages of the supply chain, from manufacturing to building design and construction. Like three legs of a stool, design, materials, and location must work together to lower a building's overall carbon footprint. The materials and industrial processes used to create new buildings drive embodied carbon emissions. But the design of a building will impact the types and volumes of materials required for construction, in addition to impacting how the building is utilized and its long-term energy consumption. Location and geography also play a significant role in greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. They influence both operational energy requirements, access to low-carbon materials, building design considerations, and patterns of mobility related to transportation accessibility. Late last year, CARB held our first workshop on embodied carbon. At that workshop, we had over 300 attendees and received numerous written comments. Thank you for those who had participated and submitted comments. There, we discussed environmental product declarations and life cycle assessment standards, as well as the scope of covered building materials. In this workshop, we will explore these topics in greater depth. Staff also received numerous written questions and comments on models and considerations for developing a baseline, as well as comments relating to environmental product declarations and life cycle assessment methodologies and accounting practices. The anticipated scope of the Embodied Carbon program and opportunities to engage with the community were also focus of comments received. We hope that this workshop provides valuable responses to some of those comments and introduces new ideas for discussion. The Embodied Carbon program applies core concepts that are common to many greenhouse gas reduction programs. To understand emissions and the magnitude of emissions reductions needed, most climate programs start by setting an emissions baseline. The emissions baseline for assessing embodied carbon is the life cycle emissions attributable to the use of building materials in the state. The current life cycle assessment system boundaries for building materials include raw material sourcing, manufacturing, site preparatory work for installation and use of materials, as well as maintenance, repair, and end-of-life considerations. Statute requires CARB to develop a comprehensive strategy for the state's building sector to achieve a 40% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of building materials by December 31st, 2035. Statute specifies that the baseline for the 40% net reduction be based on an industry average of environmental product declarations reported for the 2026 calendar year, or the most relevant up-to-date data as determined by the Air Resources Board. Staff are in the process of developing a 2026 baseline, which we intend to take to the board for consideration this year. Once a 2026 baseline is established for a greenhouse gas emissions reduction program, emissions reduction targets can be assessed. Because the Embodied Carbon program covers numerous sectors, industries, and products, each industry may face unique technology implementation and cost considerations. There will likely need to be specific targets developed for different products or industries that work together to achieve an overall 40% reduction in emissions. But staff is open to considering how else to operationalize the overall 40% reduction target. Once targets are established, it's often necessary to develop new programs and leverage existing programs to implement the strategies that work towards achieving emissions reductions that align with targets. Staff will assess what additional programs and strategies may be necessary to achieve embodied carbon emissions reductions consistent with the statutory target. Finally, most emissions reduction programs track progress toward achieving the emissions reduction targets through reporting. This is necessary to monitor the effectiveness of programs and to determine if programs or strategies should be adjusted, which is often necessary to account for economic and technological changes that differ from what was initially expected during the strategy development process. The first statutory deadline for the Embodied Carbon program is to adopt a framework for measuring the carbon intensity of building materials by the end of 2026. This carbon intensity framework encompasses both the baseline and reporting regulation topics presented today. The baseline quantifies the current life cycle emissions affiliated with building materials, The reporting framework uses collected data to track progress towards greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets in future years. After the reporting regulation is adopted, 2028 is the statutory deadline to finalize a comprehensive reduction strategy. Any programs implemented that are responsive to this strategy will help ensure that the state achieves a 40% net reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions of building materials by 2035. Before we begin the staff presentation, let's review a few core concepts introduced in the previous workshop. Life cycle assessment, or LCA, is a systematic method for quantifying the environmental impacts of a product, process, or system throughout its life cycle. An environmental product declaration, or EPD, is a standardized third-party verified document that assesses a product's environmental impacts based on an LCA. EPDs are used for voluntary reporting by some companies. Embodied carbon is the total greenhouse gas emissions generated during the production, transportation, construction, maintenance, and disposal of a material, building, or product. Carbon intensity, or CI, is a standard way to measure the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions associated with a specific unit. For instance, carbon emissions per kilogram of product, or carbon emissions per dollar spent on a product. For our first presentation today, we'll present staff concepts on how to model the baseline emissions for building materials used in California. I'll now pass the presentation over to Dr. Jeff Kessler, who will walk us through baseline modeling concepts.
Thanks, Andrea. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeff Kessler, and I am the lead technical staff working on the Embodied Carbon program here at CARB. In general, the purpose of the baseline for this program, like with other emission reduction programs, is fourfold. First, a baseline needs to be established to estimate the current level of emissions from which to evaluate changes, including emissions reductions over time. Development of the baseline requires determinations about the overall emission scope, what industries to include, and what supply chain emissions to calculate or estimate. Going through the baseline development process is also important as it helps identify priority sectors and industries to report data to CARB as part of measuring emissions reduction progress. Prior to evaluating any emissions reduction strategies, it is critical to ensure that a baseline has been established. Developing the baseline will require staff to define the sectors and eligible entities that may have direct emission reduction actions relevant for achieving emissions reduction targets. The baseline and the strategy may also be updated in future years to better reflect updates to data or to correct assumptions when new information becomes available. Let's begin with the statutory requirements for the baseline. The Embodied Carbon Program was introduced by California Assembly Bills 2446 and Assembly Bill 43 and codified into the California Health and Safety Code, sections 38561.3 and 38561.6. Section 38561.3b offers guidance on how CARB should determine the baseline. It reads, the baseline for the 40% net reduction shall be established based on an industry average of environmental product declarations reported for the 2026 calendar year, or the most relevant, up-to-date data that is available as determined by the state board. This Health and Safety Code section introduces some terms that were not defined. Defining these terms is a necessary first step toward clearly defining and developing a baseline. The baseline is an estimate of total greenhouse gas emissions of building materials used in California in 2026. Staff suggests that building material is defined as a physical product or system used or produced by the building sector that is integral and inseparable from a completed structure. Staff are also putting forward a possible building sector definition, which encompasses the economic activity related to product manufacturing and the construction, renovation, maintenance, design, and siting of buildings and infrastructure. Per this definition, the baseline includes both buildings and infrastructure, which use a common set of building materials. This definition aligns with the Health and Safety Code, but emphasizes that both the total building material usage and their emissions are estimated, not measured directly. So, how exactly is the baseline estimated? There are two fundamental pieces of information needed to estimate emissions. First, the annual quantity of building materials used in California. And second, the life cycle emissions attributable to use of those building materials. This is also known as an emissions factor or carbon intensity. Multiplying emission factors by quantities provides an estimate for the total life cycle emissions attributable to building materials, which can then be used as a basis for determining the 40% net reduction target. There are two main approaches for estimating the total quantities of building materials and building activity: top-down and bottom-up approaches. In the top-down method, the annual quantity of building materials usage is estimated using aggregate economic data. There is U.S. data available covering more than 400 unique industries, accounting for the majority of U.S. economic activity. These industry-specific economic data can be tied to emission factors for specific commodities. Emissions factors can be developed using facility-specific greenhouse gas emissions that are reported annually. In the bottom-up method, on the other hand, the quantity of building materials used is collected at the project level. These data are not currently available, but methods could be used to provide rough estimates. Quantity data coming from projects will need to be corrected to account for sampling bias. Additional scaling of that data will also be necessary to estimate total quantities of building materials used in the state. Emission factors can then be applied to these bottom-up quantities to estimate total baseline emissions. There are trade-offs in selecting a top-down versus a bottom-up approach. The top-down models tend to be readily available for implementation, but can suffer from lags in updating data. On the other hand, bottom-up models may also suffer from data lags, but apply better to specific facilities or specific projects. Developing bottom-up estimates would require significant data reporting beyond the scope of what is being presented today. It will be difficult to accurately account for quantities of materials used in California and then to match these material and product quantities to specific product-level LCAs, such as EPDs or other emissions factors. Currently, there is no adequate data set that provides an unbiased sample of bottom-up data. Moreover, there does not appear to be any tracking of statewide material usage quantities, although the concepts presented in today's workshop may help to address some of these gaps. Although the Health and Safety Code does recommend using EPDs to determine the baseline, it alternatively allows for use of other relevant, up-to-date data sources. While EPDs are increasingly common, there are many materials that lack EPDs, and consistency across EPDs can vary. Additionally, EPDs are often valid for 5 years, and the background LCA data used to estimate upstream and downstream emissions for products is often even older than that. Due to current EPD limitations, data available from state and federal emissions inventories and other LCA-based emissions factors are often more up-to-date than what is reported by EPDs. Given the challenge of collecting bottom-up quantity data and the concerns with current EPD quality and limitations, staff recommend using a top-down approach for initial baseline quantification. Staff have identified 2 potential options that use top-down datasets. The first option is that staff could use the EPA's U.S. Environmentally Extended Input-Output Model, which I will refer to as the U.S. EEIO model. Alternatively, staff could use industry average emissions from EPDs or from LCAs combined with top-down economic output data. For both options, economic data is used as the basis for estimating material consumption and building activity. The total economic demand of the building sector is multiplied with the emissions factors based on emissions per unit of economic output to estimate total life cycle emissions that can be attributed to the building sector. EPA's US EEIO model integrates 2 main data sources relevant for greenhouse gas emissions accounting. Specifically, the model uses sector-specific economic inputs and outputs from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The model also uses greenhouse gas inventories that utilize facility-specific data reported to the EPA as part of the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. Both federal Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Federal Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program data are already used by CARB for regulatory development. Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program data can also be supplemented with California-specific inventory data, which makes use of facility data collected from CARB's Mandatory Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, or the MRR. By leveraging these data sets, staff can generate robust estimates of total emissions attributed to the building sector based on North American Industry Classification System codes, or NAICS codes. NAICS codes are the standard codes used by federal statistical agencies to classify businesses by their primary economic activities. An alternative top-down approach would be to combine sector-specific economic consumption data from a source like the Federal Bureau of Economic Analysis with LCAs and EPDs instead of greenhouse gas emissions inventory or greenhouse gas reporting program data. However, conversion factors would be necessary to allow for EPD emission factors to be converted to emissions on a per dollar basis for specific commodity classes. For example, emissions per metric ton of steel or concrete would have to be translated to emissions per US dollar. This could introduce additional data collection requirements and additional quantification uncertainties. This table presents trade-offs in the 2 top-down options presented. While integrating EPDs and LCAs into baseline quantification certainly is possible, this would create additional modeling uncertainty due to the lack of robust EPD data for all building materials and the difficulty of translating EPDs to industrial commodity outputs on an economic basis. While the US EEIO model also has limitations for data disaggregation and the frequency in dataset updates, staff believe that the US EEIO model is likely to better account for emissions for current baseline modeling needs. In the future, as the Embodied Carbon Program collects more production quantity and building material emissions data, it may be possible to update baseline estimates to more accurately reflect California-specific considerations. The next part of determining the baseline emissions for building materials is identifying which life cycle stages and processes to include. This is also commonly referred to as the LCA scope. Material manufacturing emissions, or stages A1 to A3, are also referred to as cradle-to-gate emissions and are typically the minimum life cycle assessment scope required for EPDs. Including construction, use, and end-of-life emissions, stages A through C, is called a cradle-to-grave LCA. While a full cradle-to-grave LCA provides the most complete accounting framework, some stages may be omitted for specific products because they are considered trivial, lack high-quality data, or do not vary significantly within a given product class. Staff recommend modeling at least stages A1 through B5. This scope would include the emissions of materials used in both buildings and infrastructure, consistent with the definitions of building sector put forward by staff. The scope would exclude end-of-life emissions, or the C-stage emissions, which tend to be poorly characterized in LCA literature. Additionally, emissions factors that are associated with construction and demolition wastes, at least in EPA's waste reduction model, are typically insignificant for most construction and demolition wastes. This scope would also exclude building operational emissions. As previously noted, building operational emissions are often considered to be distinct from embodied carbon emissions. Under an alternative 1, the scope could be expanded to include both the end-of-life, C-stage emissions, as well as operational emissions, stages B6 and B7. This larger scope could significantly increase the quantity of baseline emissions being assessed. Including operational emissions in the program scope could better account for the interplay between material selection and its impact on operational emissions. Some products with higher embodied carbon may also yield substantial operational emissions reductions, and vice versa. Including both types of emissions in a single framework provides a more holistic framework for evaluating materials. Expanding the baseline scope could also help support other state programs focused on reducing operational emissions and assist in developing alternative fates for end-of-life materials. While there are numerous reasons to consider expanding the scope of greenhouse gas emissions accounting, there are also significant problems that may arise. For instance, expanding the scope to include operational emissions may make it more difficult to quantify and measure progress towards achieving greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for building materials. Additionally, this approach will require new methods and analysis to attribute end-of-life emissions to building materials. It is difficult to characterize emission streams that occur at the end of life, especially for biogenic materials. While it is possible to incorporate a broader scope of emissions into the baseline, this will take considerable additional time, which could also add costs and uncertainties for potentially regulated entities. Additionally, broadening the baseline scope compared to the suggested LCA scope may not significantly change reporting requirements or the actions that will ultimately be necessary to meet statutory requirements. Conversely, a smaller LCA scope for the baseline, one that excludes the B-stage use emissions, could be implemented under Alternative 2. This option includes all building material production and building construction emissions, often referred to as cradle to practical completion. However, it does not capture the full life cycle emissions of products, but this scope aligns closely with the current minimum scope standards for many building material EPDs. The next few slides present a technical overview of how the EPA's US EEIO model works. In general, the model extends input-output modeling to account for environmental impacts associated with economic activity. Input-output modeling is a Nobel Prize-winning mathematical relationship that accurately models how changes in production will create ripple effects through the economy. Because input-output modeling facilitates the complete accounting of economic activity, it makes it a well-suited foundational tool to utilize alongside collected and verified government data about environmental flows to accurately capture life cycle impacts in the economy. The underlying economic data used for the input-output portion of the USEIO model is collected and aggregated by the Federal Bureau of Economic Analysis. The Federal Bureau of Economic Analysis compiles the complete use of commodities or inputs by industries that are operating in the U.S., as well as the complete production of commodities or outputs from U.S. firms. Input-output modeling allows for these make and use tabulations to be used to calculate the impact that marginal production for a given commodity might have on the rest of the economy. The US EEIO model combines this powerful data set with government-reported environmental data. The U.S. Census Bureau conducts the economic census every 5 years. This census is the official measure of business in the United States and provides comprehensive statistics at the national, state, and local levels. It serves as the benchmark for current economic activity. The Federal Bureau of Economic Analysis conducts additional annual surveys and also utilizes tax records to develop comprehensive input-output accounts of economic flows for the entire U.S. economy. These flows are further categorized by subsector and industry according to the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS codes. In environmentally extended input-output frameworks, environmental flows are tied directly to economic flows across the economy. These environmental flows are based on reported and recorded government data pertaining to wastes and other non-monetized commodity outputs. These flows include recorded information like kilograms of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere or phosphorus runoffs to watersheds. The US EIO model takes environmental flow data from numerous government sources, including energy data from the Energy Information Agency, and greenhouse gas emissions from the National Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory and the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, as well as numerous other data sources to provide complete, measured accounting of the environmental impacts of industrial activity in the United States, not just greenhouse gas emissions. The US EEIO model aggregates and attributes these environmental flows to specific economic sectors. The aggregate level of output from the sectors, alongside the aggregate economic activity for each sector, provides accurate information pertaining to the direct environmental impacts associated with the production of goods and services. The direct environmental impacts for each sector are then utilized for generating life cycle emissions estimates. The US EEIO model uses standard input-output mathematical matrix methods to calculate the total requirements needed to produce 1 unit of output from a sector. Total requirements includes both the direct inputs, such as coal and natural gas purchased by a steel plant, as well as the indirect inputs, the inputs purchased all the way up the supply chain in an interconnected economy to create all units of output needed. For instance, for a building project that purchases steel, there would be a direct input of steel and indirect inputs of coal and natural gas because these inputs were needed to produce the steel used for the project. Using this mathematical approach, the US EEIO model accurately estimates the total life cycle emissions flows associated with each dollar of industry-specific output. Emissions flows into different basins, such as into air, water, or land, are detailed by chemical species. This includes elemental flows like water, carbon dioxide, methane, phosphorus, nitrous oxide, and many others. Each of these species have unique environmental impacts that must be interpreted. This is done through life cycle impact analysis, where elemental flows are converted to estimate environmental impact. For greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, environmental impacts are expressed in carbon dioxide equivalents. Each elemental flow has a unique global warming potential, or GWP, which is based on its contribution to radiative forcing, or how much heat a specific molecule may capture. These values are then normalized to the radiative forcing potential of carbon dioxide. For North American life cycle assessment, the standard impact assessment tool used is the Tool for Reduction and Assessment of Chemicals and Other Environmental Impacts, or TRACE. The US EEIO model has been developed using publicly available government data and has been created using open source software development licenses in Python and R. As such, the modeling platform can be modified to better reflect California-specific data inputs. The EPA has developed another open source tool, the State Input-Output Model, or State-IO. State-IO uses commodities trade data across different states in the United States and maps these trade flows onto the input-output data that the Bureau of Economic Analysis collects. The model then estimates state input-output matrices from the national input-output tables compiled annually. The State-IO model follows standard approaches to calculate state-level input-output tabulations that reflect the flow of goods between a state of interest and the rest of the United States. Using a two-region input-output matrix, the US EEIO model is well suited for estimating life cycle greenhouse gas emissions that are relevant to products that are produced, delivered to, and ultimately used in California. Using this two-region model can allow CARB staff to more precisely calculate California-specific emission factors and life cycle emissions for building materials and construction activity in the state. This concludes the section on baseline modeling. Staff are seeking feedback on a variety of important topics. We would like to hear from members of the public about the suggested staff definitions for building materials, building sector, and baseline. Additionally, CARB staff would like to hear more from the public about the LCA scopes that should be considered. The current staff recommendation is to estimate life cycle emissions associated with stages A1 to B5, consistent with ISO 21930 and what has been identified in statute. CARB is also seeking feedback on reasonable data vintages for life cycle assessment data. That is, how old can and should the usable data be? Finally, staff is seeking feedback to better understand if there are other models, data sources, or tools that CARB should consider using that might supplement or bolster estimates that are fundamentally derived from government data and the life cycle assessment results from using the US EEIO model. I will take this time to also make note that staff is looking to hold future public engagement, including a potential technical meeting specifically for baseline modeling considerations and the US EEIO model. Please subscribe to the Embodied Carbon listserv to stay informed of future public engagement opportunities. We'll now open the conversation for public comments, and I will pass the presentation to Jeremy Loeb.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Jeremy Loeb, Air Resources Engineer working on the Embodied Carbon Technical Analysis team at the Air Resources Board. For the public comment process, CARB staff will be relying on the raise hand feature in Zoom. If you have a question, please use the raise hand feature in the Zoom toolbar. When staff call your name, please unmute yourself by clicking the red button in the pop-up window that appears when you are called upon, and proceed to introduce yourself and any affiliations you may hold. If you are a phone attendee, please dial *9 to raise or lower your hand. When your phone number is called, please dial *6 to mute or unmute yourself prior to speaking. If you prefer to submit a written comment or question, please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Written comments and questions will be answered after all spoken comments have been addressed. The comment period will close at 11:55 a.m. We will do our best to address all comments and questions received. There will be another opportunity during the afternoon presentation to submit additional comments.
Sorry, just give us a second. We're figuring out the Zoom raise hand feature to make sure we can get everybody in the right order and everything.
Okay. We do see several raised hands, and we will call on folks in the order that hands have been raised. Our next commenter is Scott Farbman. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Hey there. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Hi, everyone. Scott Farbman. I'm a senior manager at Energy Solutions. I have a question for Jeff Kessler around the cost data that is being collected. And I'm curious how that cost data is being considered for complex and dynamic materials like concrete and steel, where like a cost per square foot might be very different depending on not just location but design of the building, maybe some specific product performance requirements and the specifications of the building. It just seems like those are really hard materials to drill down on a very like cost per square foot or cost per pound or ton basis. So I'm just curious if there's some more feedback there that could be provided, or some more information on how that could be better looked at or approached. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. That's a really interesting question. I think there's kind of a lot of things to unpack within that. You know, we're talking about the costs as a metric to use regarding the baseline discussion in the prior presentation, and it feels like what you're getting into delves a little bit more into perhaps whole building life cycle assessment and those kinds of concerns. So I don't think I have a really great way to answer your very specific question. Maybe if there's more you want to add about how that intersects with the baseline, we could try. Otherwise, perhaps this is a question we could work with you and try to answer offline, or make sure we try to work into our future public engagements of how we answer those types of specific questions.
Okay. Our next commenter is Mikhail Haramati. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Hi there, I'm Michal Harmati, and I lead the state-level industrial decarbonization work at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Very helpful to see this walkthrough of the potential approaches. For the baseline modeling, a question and a comment. The question is for the federal data sets used in the US EIO model, what will happen if these data sets are not maintained by the current administration? And is there sufficient historical data in the models already that maybe it's possible to use them as is? Or will there be a need for additional California-specific data collection?
Yeah, so thank you. So just as a reminder, the baseline that we've developed is a fixed point in time, or I shouldn't say that we have developed, that we're proposing would be a fixed point in time. So it's based on historical data. The data that we would be using to track programs going forward would be direct submissions to CARB, and it's something that we'll talk about in more detail in the afternoon session. So hopefully that kind of gets you what you're looking for as far as an answer there.
All right. Our next commenter is Martha Armas Kelly. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Good afternoon. Good morning. Martha Armas Kelly, Catholic Charities Environmental Justice Program and Community Initiatives for Collective Impact in Merced County board member. I'm really trying to wrap my head around the way that this would be offered to the community in a way that they could digest a lot of this information, because your terminology, acronyms, any kind of explanation as to this theory and the matrix that you're using is way above the threshold of your common community member, your lay person. But for the fact that I've sat in on many of these sessions with, professors, academia, and scientists, I would not have any idea of how to explain that or break it down to my community members. And it's critical for the community to be aware of such endeavors on your part and on part of CARB. The fact that you're looking at the industry is very, well, it's refreshing, because we've typically we have the knowledge that 40% or more emissions are caused by construction. However, now that you're looking at it, it's exciting, because now we're looking at the real picture. It's not just based on cars. It's based on industry as well. And for that, I just want to know, how are you going to disseminate that? And if you are going to look at approaching community so that they understand how, I think that it would be best served if we were able to have like CBOs trained and given a little bit of kind of like about buffers before you actually introduce it to the community, because it's so impactful that this information should be broken down in a way that they can digest.
Yeah, thank you for that, Martha. I guess there's a few things I'd like to say in response, in addition to just, that's great feedback. I think we're always open to help from folks who have ideas about exactly how we reach out to folks and make connections with us to folks who are more interested in learning about the program. So generally, we are hoping to have potentially a few more public engagements on this topic this year. So hopefully we'll be able to engage more people, get the word out a little bit better. I think we're always trying to do a better job of defining our terms. There was a question in the chat about that we really appreciate. So we'll try to make sure we do that. I will also just make a quick note about the overall process and the plan of responding to the statute that directs us to implement this program. So for now, what we're talking about is, if I can say simply, is simply a reporting program and the baseline in order to get more information on building materials and projects on what embodied carbon emissions they are responsible for. There will also be future development of a strategy for how we would deal with getting to the 40% target by 2035 for the embodied carbon space. So like I say, I imagine there will be further public engagement on this year, and then further process as we go forward there. And love to hear your feedback, especially on how you think we can do a good job of reaching out to any of the communities that are affected or want more information.
So thank you. So basically, you're just presenting the matrix of how you're going to start and initiate the project by grading that baseline, correct?
Yeah, so creating the baseline is an important consideration because it gives us an idea of where we're at in 2026 per the statute. And the other big deal is developing a reporting regulation so that we become sort of, if I can use the term, a clearinghouse of data around building materials that are used in California and projects that occur in California in both the residential and non-residential space.
So then I'd be inclined to want to respect the comment from the earlier gentleman that said that we should look at the bigger picture, because if we're going to be fair, we have to look at the project from inception and from all areas, the complete cycle of that project, because you would only get I guess skewed data from just what you're looking at the currently, rather than looking at the overall beginning and the end of a project with the raw materials.
Yeah, that's great feedback. We'll definitely keep that in mind and continue to work on that.
Thank
you. Okay. Our next commenter is John Blue. John, please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Hi, thanks for having me. This is John Blue with Acorn West Associates. I just wanted to comment on your discussion of the scoping the life cycle assessment, and offer support for including in-use emissions there, because that fits more within CARB's other programs, and thinking about if we're trying to encourage good use of resources in the state. Thinking about it more long-term is important. Think about the electric vehicle model, where the comparison of internal combustion vehicles versus electric vehicles, there's not a huge difference in the embodied energy of the product, but the life cycle emissions, there's a dramatic difference between the two. So same can be considered for a lot of building materials.
Yeah, no, thank you for that
Thanks.
comment. I will point you to our sister program, which is the building decarbonization program that's more focused on operational energy. And so we work closely with both of our teams together, but that might be something we could drop a link to as well.
Thanks.
Okay. Our next commenter is Martha Armis-Kelly. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
I just had one more point to make. I wanted to know if I know that you're just creating the matrix, but you're also proposing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in this industry. How are you going to create the teeth for this? What kind of regulations are you looking to make sure that this even meets that deadline?
Yeah, so that's a question that's more related to the development of the strategy that we're going to engage in the future after this regulation is complete. So it's not something that we're prepared to talk about at today's workshop, but we'll announce more information when we get there.
Maybe just to add, Martha, thanks for engaging and asking all these questions. So just adding, Lex already answered, but I just wanted to reiterate that really right now we're just trying to assess the magnitude of emissions out there. So it's more of getting, this is more of a reporting just to see what's out there, what are the emissions, what are the sources. But in terms of the actual greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies, we'll be coming back with a strategy in a few years as outlined in the statute. And then again, working on what specific regulations will be needed, what enforcement. So there's more to come. This is really the step one to try to get a handle of what these emissions and sources are. So I hope that helps. But of course, we definitely want to talk to you more. So reach out to us. We can have more conversations about it. But thanks for participating.
Okay, our next commenter is Marty Walters. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Hi, good morning. This is Marty Walters. I'm a resident of Plumas County, and I'm also a consultant with Recovery Risk. I work on the intersection of climate resilience and sustainability for existing buildings and how they're financed. So I thought I'd put a few notes in about system boundaries and waste management. I was kind of thinking to myself as you were talking about that, and the way that, if we're going to exclude end of life for the building materials embodied carbon, it would be good to consider more than just the demolition waste management, into landfills exit, which I think is the assumption that end of life doesn't generate a lot of carbon emissions, but also consider disaster damaged materials and the way that they get converted into different kinds of, issues and ways that they need to be managed from a waste management perspective. And also conversions from wildfire, where you have a lot of building materials that are turned into air emissions, and just thinking about that in terms of the system boundaries and where CARB is going in terms of, accounting for that, whether it's this program or whether it's somewhere else. I just think it's important to consider all different ways that building materials are experiencing end of life, I guess is the way I would say it. And then my second comment about system boundaries is similar, but more about toxics and how we think about toxics and reducing impacts from toxic chemicals in building materials. And, of course, that's something that we're always concerned about in California. And we have a whole consumer products safety program within DTSC that's tackling some of those issues. And I think getting back to some of Martha's comments about the bigger system and how this affects communities, I think about how decisions in selecting building materials, both in construction, but also in CapEx and maintenance, type of activities, are going to be shaped by not just carbon and embodied carbon, but also, a bunch of other considerations. And I think toxics is one of the important ones to consider as we're thinking about, this program and system boundaries. And that's it.
Thank you, Marty. That's a really detailed and great set of comments. I really appreciate that. I think it's a good point, maybe at this point, for a reminder that we will have a written public comment period after the workshop. So definitely, to the extent that you have specific recommendations on any of the things that we've talked about today, we'd love to hear from you in those written comments. They really help us to further develop the proposal. And thank you.
Okay, our next commenter, and please forgive me if I am mispronouncing anyone's names, is Indranil Ganguly. Please unmute yourself and provide your comment.
Thank you for calling on me. And I first, I'm a professor at University of Washington, not from California. I was asked by one of my collaborators at UC Berkeley to come and join this. I'm joining this as I'm also the vice president of CORIM, which is one of the groups that develop wood-based LCAs. Before I ask my question, I want to congratulate Jeff for such a clear and presentation. So great job, thank you. My question is about the baselining, and it seems like I've done some comparative life cycle assessment for whole buildings, also building materials. And when we look at building materials, it's kind of very difficult to do a baselining of a material like concrete or steel versus wood. It may be I-beams, it may be glulam beams, because these are not apples to apples comparative assessment. We often end up doing a systems level analysis and systems level baselining to be able to, which can go up to a building level or building systems like walls systems or flooring diaphragm systems. So I would like to also kind of try to understand what you are thinking along those lines. And my suggestion would be to think about systems level. And also, when we are looking at structures, that's one of the things we're looking at. Structural systems baselining works better for embodied carbon. When we do it with non-structural materials, sometimes the embodied carbon can be much higher to save the operational carbon. For example, double glazed window panels, paints, and all that. So if somehow this kind of embodied carbon baselining discriminates against some of those products which have a sincere benefit for operation benefit, that may be a trade-off. And I would like to see how the committee is thinking about those concepts. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Janelle. Yeah, so in the current proposal for the baseline, we're looking at sort of the straight life cycle analysis-based emissions associated with each of the materials and sectors that come out of sort of like the what we're talking about in there. But I think to the extent that you have suggestions on how we should do that, how we should change that, or which data sources we should use, et cetera, I think that would be a really great place for you to submit a written comment. I'm going to see real quick if Jeff has anything, Jeff Kessler has anything else that he'd like to add, but that's all I have to say.
Yeah, thanks for your comments and questions. I think it's worth clarifying that how we're thinking of baseline and how we have been directed to consider it statutorily is the cumulative total of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So the way that you, I think, were mostly using the term baseline, we tend to refer to as a benchmark, which is specific benchmarking activities for individual materials or benchmarking activities for projects. That, in terms of benchmark questions, Lex is exactly right. We'd appreciate any additional information that you might submit to us, but we are likely only going to be really considering benchmark considerations as we move into the strategy development. Whereas the baseline development and how we're using the term baseline is this cumulative total of greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector from which we can assess what a 40% reduction target will be. And then we can develop the strategy of how you get there, which would include, potentially benchmarks for different material classes and types, if that helps clarify and answer the question. But please submit more in written comments. And we'd love to understand some of your thinking or other data sources you might have that we should look at.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Lex.
Okay. Our next commenter is Will Chialone. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to ask this question. I work at a company called Agriplex, and we create a supplementary cementitious material called ground glass pozzolan. I was wondering about your guys' acceptance to SCMs in general to help decarbonize concrete. This kind of goes into the materials portion as well as in specifics to ground glass pozzolan. Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is an interesting point. I think that this is one of those sort of questions that delves into the strategy and future regulation for reducing embodied carbon, because at this point, we're simply talking about getting folks to report their activity and the emissions associated with that activity. So I don't think there will be any discussion of kind of comparison of different types of cementitious materials within this proposal. Thank you.
Okay, our next commenter is Nick Camerata. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Hi, thanks very much. Nick Camerata on behalf of the California building industry, representing California's home builders. We were integral to the negotiations of the bill, and both of them. And just a comment, I know you're working on baseline, and it was always our understanding, and it's reflected in the language of the bill, that what we're going to be responsible for is cradle to gate. And it seems to me now you have gone quite a bit beyond that. And that was not something that was contemplated. In fact, to the extent that it was raised, we indicated that when you do transportation from the gate to a project site and the construction and the GHG emissions associated with that, that's already covered by CEQA, and we wanted to keep those separate. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, how did we get here? Why are we here? And I think it's going to be tough enough for home builders to meet just the criteria that's in the legislation as it is, but to complicate it with more things, I think just makes it more and more likely that the cost impact and feasibility provisions are going to be ubiquitous, if you will.
Thanks for that, Nick. Really appreciate that feedback. So when we're looking at the statute, it does say to have a focus on the product stage of A1 through A3, which is kind of, as you described, the cradle to gate emissions. It doesn't say exclusively or anything like that. So we look at that as saying, that the life cycle analysis should definitely include that phase of the life cycle. And then we're talking here about, are there other parts of that scope that we should include? Clearly, I think that you're going to have some feedback for us that I hope you get to us in addition to this form, which we note into the written form. So just reiterate that I really appreciate that comment.
Okay, thank you.
All right, our next commenter is Casey Wander. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Hi, I'm Casey Wander with the University of California. I'm with the Green Building Working Group, where we're trying to promote sustainable building projects and also looking at this from a building owner's perspective. My question is, how do you envision this being documented and enforced? Would building owners need to provide emissions modeling on a project by project basis?
Yeah, so I think that we're going to talk more in depth about the actual reporting in this afternoon's slide deck, but yeah, so probably that will be the best point to have further discussion about this, because there are some differences in which projects would be responsible for what. So sorry to say, hold your hand, but hopefully we can address you later.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, moving on. Our next commenter is Ruth Lehman. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Ruth Lehman. I'm with the Precast Pre-Stressed Concrete Institute. And I agree with a couple of speakers who have talked about the full life cycle and being able to measure that in terms of truly understanding the impact of embodied carbon. But I'm not the only one. But I had a couple of quick questions. First of all, I guess I want to understand, I didn't quite hear it in the presentation, but I want to understand why CARB is looking at adding A4, A5. And as much as my industry would like to have it be the full, all the way A1 to C4, I'm not sure I understand where you're coming from, other than you think it's an easy grab. And when I have producers and people in our industry who are collecting a lot of data and developing EPDs and things like that, and they've been directed to, based on their PCR, to develop those based on A13. I'm just kind of curious as to what that motivation was. So thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Ruth. Really appreciate the question. I think that just in general, a principle of life cycle analysis is to capture the fullest extent of emissions that you can with, with reasonable bounds and scope, only really trying to omit things if they're insignificant or you've got a good reason to do so. So, kind of as I answered to Nick's question, we see in the statute that there's a focus on A1 through A3, but we think that there are emissions that exist outside of that A1 through A3 that are important to capture. And so that's why we are proposing to also include that, or A4 to A5 in that part of the scope. But once again, I'm going to plug this indefinitely here. We definitely appreciate your written comments. I'm sure there are many things that you can tell us there that will be very helpful for us.
All right. Our next comment comes from John O'Hagan. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is John O'Hagan. I'm a structural engineer at Farrell Alcesser in San Francisco, and I chair the Sustainable Design Committee underneath the Structural Engineering Association for California. And I know that our central committee has had some correspondence with you in the past already, but one of the things that I wanted to really reiterate, and I really appreciated that Indranil brought this up as well earlier, that I would strongly encourage to evaluate based on systems, not overall buildings. And I understand the reasoning for wanting to look at overall buildings, because you want to set like maybe the average across all of them and then look at how all the buildings perform against that one average. But specifically when using, the other thing I wanted to focus on in particular was the mention of use of the EIO LCA database. I did some research on this about a year ago with a student from Stanford comparing EIO LCA data information to product information from LCAs. And we found that there was at times a significant discrepancy between the use of the two data for structural materials themselves by like an order of magnitude of 10 or more. And so I wanted to just kind of caution to look at that specifically. And again, I think it ties in a lot with the use of evaluating things based on systems versus setting just kind of one number for each building. And maybe, again, you use the systems to get to that average, but by evaluating at the system level. So again, I would add this to the public comment as well but yeah, that particularly jumped out at me, and I wanted to bring that up.
Thanks, John. That's helpful feedback. I think to the extent that when you hopefully present written comments to us, that you can specifically tie those back to how it relates to the baseline and the reporting and everything, that will be most helpful for us at this point. I'm having a little bit of a difficulty connecting some of the system things to our current proposal, and they feel more like our future strategy type of thing. But to the extent that I'm wrong about that, and you can kind of help me connect it and staff connect the dots on that, that would be really helpful as well. I just wanted to take a second to mention we're aware that there are some comments in the queue in Zoom's Q&A function. I think we're going to have enough time to get through all the hands and then get to the Zoom Q&A. So if you submitted something there, we haven't forgotten about you.
Okay, thank you.
On that note, our next commenter is Lisa Podesto. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Thank you. Lisa Podesto with Swinnerton Builders, and Director of Sustainable Innovation. I also sit on the Structural Engineers Association Sustainable Design Committee, like the last speaker. My comments for this section are specific to, well, first a comment on the life cycle what's included and what's not in this evaluation. From my perspective, if the mandate is to evaluate cumulative, to try to speculate on future emissions in both operations and end of life. I mean, I'm not disagreeing that those are important attributes and also should be considered within, you know, decisions that people are making, but it seems like it's erroneous in some way to include that if those emissions have not yet been, you know, happened. If a building is not going to get torn down for 60 years, then why would that be currently included in a current cumulative baseline? I guess my other question is more if I would agree that probably at this stage, like tracking the conversation here, that it makes sense to do this top-down approach for baselining. But then I guess that raises the question on from data collection, and I know that this is, you're not talking specifically about reporting here, but like, how are you going to connect ground up reporting with top down baselining? There's a moment at which, you know, how can you actually measure progress? Is the idea to continue to reevaluate on some interval from the top down so that you can understand how those two approaches would relate to each other?
Thanks for that, Lisa. I think, first of all, a clarification, the baseline doesn't include the B phase operational emissions. So maybe that is just enough to answer your concern there. Let's see, regarding the other components. So as far as keeping track of our progress over time, the baseline may or may not end up being the tool that we use to do that track keeping. We may end up using our reported data in the program. We just really won't know exactly how we're going to keep that track until we get to the strategy portion of our implementation. So for now, we're really talking about setting a target in the baseline and setting a reporting regulation. Sorry, I didn't mean target. Setting a current value for 2026 in the baseline and setting up a reporting system. Everything else we can hopefully discuss at that strategy development later on.
Okay, and I guess just to be clear, my comment about, I guess, was less about operational and more about end of life. It seems like not including the end of life because those emissions have not happened yet makes the most sense in the baselining.
Gotcha. Yes, that might be more of an alternative proposal that we presented. So, thank you.
All right. Our next commenter is Josh Jacobs. Josh, please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Josh Jacobs from WAP Sustainability. Thank you very much for the presentation, the opportunity to comment. We certainly look forward to submitting written comments. We did that previously, we'll do that again. And we're very big fans of the bills and what California is looking to do. Do have a little bit of an issue. The previous commenter said a decent amount, so I'm not going to completely repeat what she said. Wonderful statement, though. There are more and more that we do EEIO, we're finding issues with it. In fact, WBCSD and WRI have stated companies should be cautious when prioritizing climate action activities based on financial contribution, as expenditures and revenues may not correlate well with emissions. They've stated this. Two of the leading organizations on the planet in doing what you folks are trying to do have stated, don't do this way. I also appreciate the timing issues of having to set a method and develop a baseline. You guys are under enormous pressure to get done a massive thing. But I would also, like the last commenter and some others, say you have to have a fairly good idea of how you're going to measure reductions and the strategy that you're going to come up with. Because if you switch methodologies between setting the baseline and measuring the reductions, you're going to have massive uncertainties. which are going to lead to untrustworthiness, which is certainly what we don't want out of these two incredible bills and the program that's coming out of them. I want as rock solid as we can get so that other states and other municipalities and authorities having jurisdictions follow your lead. I'm begging you to, let's think of the second step while we're doing the first, so that we don't have that uncertainty. Thank you, and looking forward to commenting.
Yeah, thanks for that, Josh. Definitely appreciate your comments on the strategy and tracking and everything. I'm going to hand it to Jeff really quick to sort of look at your or respond to your first part of your question.
Yeah, Josh, really great comments. Definitely provide some more written feedback and references to us if you can. In general, within life cycle assessment and what is laid out in ISO standards, economic allocation approaches and considerations of economic impact are decent methods and adhere to methods, especially within the LCA literature, for attributing greenhouse gas emissions. The US EIO model is also a open source public data set that uses direct government data that is often directly representative of the entirety of the US economy. So there are a number of really compelling data source reasons to use US EIO and the underlying data sources. They've been verified and reported directly to government institutions. We can also supplement the model with data that is reported directly to California and that we currently make use of in our greenhouse gas programs. Many of our greenhouse gas emission reduction programs actually do create strong price incentives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We know that there are other federal subsidies elsewhere that are also tied directly to carbon pricing, which create clear revenue signals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So there are a number of very compelling and interesting things to consider with the US EIO framework. And it certainly comparability of pricing to functional units that are not based on dollar metrics can be challenging and is not without, its own set of methodological considerations. But we would definitely appreciate additional feedback and comments that you might have, and also from others that are on the call. Please let us know if there are significantly preferable approaches or if there are concerns. Thank you.
Our next commenter is Jordan Palmieri. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Jordan Palmieri, and I work with the Carbon Leadership Forum. First off, thank you so much for the really thoughtful presentation. It was really well done. And I was also really encouraged to hear the scope of the materials under the bill will include both construction materials used for buildings and infrastructure. So that was great to hear. My question is how the state EEIO model for the baseline will deal with foreign imported materials that are consumed in California. Thank you.
Yeah, so just a reminder that the baseline itself is looking at all of the kind of movement of goods within the United States, and then trying to attribute that to how we what comes into California. So how I think maybe what you're referring to is more regarding the reporting part of the thing, part of the proposal. So there's more to be worked out on exactly who reports and et cetera, but maybe we can save that for this afternoon session.
I don't know if, oh yeah, my voice is still live. Okay. No, I don't think I'm asking about the reporting. I heard that the state model looks at, trading between states and accounts for that, but I didn't hear whether or not it accounts for materials imported from foreign countries and consumed in California.
Yeah, Jordan, I'm happy to provide some additional clarity on that, and I think this is also a great topic for further discussion at a future, more in the weeds technical meeting around baseline approaches and USEIO. But so the USEIO model does do a balance of trade assessment, which uses imports nationally. And then there's also then commodity tracking of various flows across the states. So it does break out emissions on a domestic US basis and a non-domestic basis. And it uses EXIO-base, which is an EIA framework to provide international emissions estimate that then get incorporated. And so when you move to the two region state model, it does take into account that import to the United States and then trade flows across the United States, at which point the materials get imported. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you, Jeff. I'm really glad to hear that's included in the model. Thanks.
Cool. Great. Thanks.
All right. We do have a few more commenters. Our next comment is from Paul Poirier. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Hi, I'm an architect from Santa Barbara, and I'm a past chair of the American Institute of Architects Committee on the Environment, and I'm still currently on that committee. And we've been exploring how to lower the embodied carbon of buildings. And so an area I've been delving into myself is concrete, and meeting with Cal Portland and the small concrete plant people in the West Coast to talk about different ways and what capabilities they have to do that. And unlike other things like building adhesives or caulking or air quality that has become law in California, there isn't a single catch-all that is applicable in all areas of the state or the West Coast to lower the embodied carbon. So there's different strategies depending on which aggregates available and which materials are available in Southern California and San Diego than in Northern California or the Central Coast where I am. So we're exploring what capabilities the plants have to lower the embodied carbon of concrete, because I think only 25% or 30% of the concrete's used for buildings, and the other percentage is used for infrastructure, bridges, roadways, other civil engineering construction. And if we're able to come up with some low-hanging fruit to lower the embodied carbon of the concrete for everything and make that the standard that comes out of a plant, it'll greatly reduce the embodied carbon of everything in California, buildings and infrastructure. So we're working with them to try to quantify that for Type L concrete. They have updated the Green Book so that Type L concrete is available for civil engineers to have the specs for placing it, because it changes if you use, say, a pulverized limestone along with Portland cement to lower the embodied carbon.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, but it sounds like you're getting really detailed in your comment that might be better suited for written comments. Is there like a direct question that you want to have addressed right now, or?
I wanted to just say that the AIA is up for collaborating with you in the future on different, I think embodied carbon is a little more complicated than kind of operational energy. You know, it's easy to say, okay, go all electric, get rid of the carbon fuel and do this, do that. And it's easy to do because I think the regionalism is more in play with embodied carbon, and it'll be different solutions that are different in different micro regions.
That's great. We really appreciate that. You know, I think we have a couple of ways to contact us to make sure that you or anyone else in this webinar who wants to get a hold of us and further collaborate. Some of that's on the slide, especially our embodied carbon email. Your written comments will be very appreciated. And thank you very much for that, Paul. And I do apologize again for cutting you off. We're running close to maybe not finishing every question we've received, but thank you.
Okay, we do have one more raised hand. Our next commenter is Mike Malinowski. Please unmute yourself and share your comment.
Thank you and congratulations on this excellent presentation. I particularly applaud the great comments and discussion. My name is Mike Malinowski. I'm here on behalf of the American Institute of Architects, California. Many on this call know that AI California was the main driver behind the mandatory embodied carbon measures that are now in Calgary, the first in the United States. Concurrent with our efforts to move that forward, we are also trying to address California's acute housing crisis. And I just wanted to point out that the concepts here for reporting, which ultimately would reflect future regulatory actions, talk about residential units. And there's a huge difference between a 3,000 square foot house and a 300 square foot ADU. And both are a residential unit. Both can even have the same occupancy classification. The small house is inherently less carbon intensive than a large unit. So when you get to the point where you talk about reporting, one of the principles that we used in bringing this embodied carbon advance to California was to make sure that we approach the industry carefully. So we don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, if you will, and discourage progress while we advance. We can have both, advancing climate action as well as working with the industry to make changes in a measured, thoughtful way. I see you've picked up on the square foot threshold we used, where we have found that a small number of large projects can impact a lot of square footage. Just want to urge caution when you start to talk about residential units. There has to be something far more refined and granular to consider what the unit is. Otherwise, you are potentially creating a discouraging element for small residential units, which we actually need a lot more of in California. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment, Mike. Once again, I'm going to point to the strategy development portion of this program, which has not yet kind of been kicked off and will be in the future, and we'll have future announcements about that. So I think at this point, we've gotten through the raised hands that have come up to now, so we'll transition over to trying to answer the question and answer questions that people have submitted in that Zoom function. I just want to reiterate one broad question that we've gotten several times in the Q&A. Hopefully we can sort of just get that out of the way, is that there are questions about the intersection of this program and federal data and the continuance of submission of data to federal programs. And I want to remind people what I talked about earlier, that the reporting regulation that we're talking about would be submission of data directly to CARB, so is sort of independent from anything that is, any concerns about federal data submission. So with that out of the way, let's see where we can go to. We'll try to mark these and take them in order.
Our first question, written question, is from Emily Flynn, and Emily is asking, how does the US EEIO model allow companies and projects to track and achieve carbon reductions? It sounds like US EEIO is focused on carbon accounting only. We want to empower companies and projects to reduce emissions.
Yeah, so I think that probably the best answer to this is that the US EEIO model that we've discussed today is proposed to be included as a resource for the development of the baseline, which is sort of, like I said, a static number of where we're at in 2026. And so as far as reducing carbon in the future, that would be based on the reporting data that we would require as the output of this regulation that we're developing right now, and would not be based on US EEIO.
Excellent. Our next written question is from Robert Glass. Robert writes, California has seismic requirements on building construction not required elsewhere. How will national data be scaled to account for these added requirements?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think that really we should get more information on you from how you think we should be doing that. We're definitely aware of the increased seismicity concerns in California and how that affects the buildings here. I'm not sure how we've accounted for that. Probably it's a thing that also would be really great to mention. We're planning to have further engagement that gets very specific and detailed into how we want to talk about the baseline based on the written feedback we get today as well. So thank you.
Okay. Our next question comes from Tom DeVore, who asks, will you be establishing embodied carbon baselines by building type? As noted, residential projects differ from commercial, and taller, larger commercial projects have higher kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per meter squared than smaller ones. Thank you.
Yeah, so as was mentioned earlier, the current proposal for baseline is looking at the emissions of building materials and projects in California as a cumulative whole. So for the baseline, there wouldn't be a different baseline for different projects based on their building type and things like that as the proposal currently exists.
Our next question is from David Kirk. For spend-based data, how do you account for this issue? Low carbon materials often cost more than low carbon alternatives. If the market shifts to higher cost low carbon materials, a cost-based methodology would show carbon emissions going up when in fact they are going down.
Yeah, so this one, I think that the best answer is that the baseline, once again, is a static cumulative number for 2026. And so the changes as it regards to the baseline of future emissions wouldn't be reflected in the 2026 baseline because those emissions would occur in the future and those changes would occur in the future.
Okay, our next question from Luke Lombardi. How does CARB plan to interact with CalGreen and other local policy initiatives to reduce embodied carbon?
So we have been working with our sister agencies. We hope to continue to do so. The statute points out particular agencies that we're required to work with. If there are specific local policy initiatives that you think we're not aware of that we should be, please send that information to us. We do try to keep track of what's going on throughout the state as well. So yeah, we interact with those folks as much as we possibly can.
Next question from Scott Farman. Is the baseline data set going to be publicly available? And if so, is there an anticipated release date?
Thanks. This is a great question about process. So we're hoping to have additional public engagement, including release of additional materials to give more specific information about how we end up proposing more specifically to develop that based both on what the feedback that we get here and concepts that we have going into that process. So yes, we anticipate well, for one, the USCEIO data is already public available, but our specific look at that, we do anticipate it being public. I don't unfortunately have a specific release date at this point. I think we can go back to the phone, or rather, I guess it's not the phone, but the raised hands for a moment.
Sure. Yeah, we do have one more commenter, Daniel Berkshinger. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, sir, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so my question will be regarding customer from the community, yes? So imagine that you work for example, a conveying equipment sector, and based on all that you shared until now, your knowledge and based on what's been proposed, uh, what what will be the necessary steps that you would adopt for a lift equipment to fully be compliance with the guidelines or what is being suggested?
Yeah. So my initial feedback to you is that I don't think this applies to you or your client, because you're it sounds like you're an equipment operator. So there may be other CARB programs as far as heavy equipment that would apply to you. I would ask, please send us an email at our Embodied Carbon program email, so that we can either further clarify whether there's whether I'm misunderstanding, or whether there are other CARB programs that we should direct you to for compliance.
Yeah, because I was wondering, elevators are part from the construction industries. Yes, they are specified for the buildings, and that's why we are gonna be in the end being pushed to apply to help to reduce or to aim the target from that construction. So that's why what's our part in this big block parts of parts? Yeah, so
Yeah. Sorry, I think maybe I misunderstood what you meant by lifting equipment. I thought you were talking forklifts and heavy equipment.
No,
You're
elevators.
talking
Yeah,
about elevators.
yeah.
So I think that we need to get back together with you with more details as we get closer to a full proposal to be able to answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm gonna send an email. Maybe we can dig more into this. Okay.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Our next written question comes from April Morris. When considering LCA scope, will the same LCA scope apply to all product types, or will each product type have its own LCA scope? For example, could product type A have an LCA scope of cradle to gate, and product type B have an LCA scope of cradle to grave?
Yeah, so under the current concept that we've presented, the LCA scope would apply to all of the building material types and wouldn't be segregated by type.
Okay, next question. I would support keeping the scope narrow to cradle to gate. The A1 to A3 phase emissions are directly under the control of the manufacturer. It encourages behavior change at the manufacturer scale, which is the goal of all of this. While the rest of the life cycle is important, parentheses B stages, those impacts do not change manufacturing behaviors without other supportive policy like EPR, deconstruction requirements, etc., which are not part of this regulation, correct?
That's a really great reminder that and we're always aware of this, that there are multiple CARB programs that all intersect, even if they're not in the same industry, because things like construction doesn't just involve emissions from buildings, it involves emissions from equipment, etc. Like I just misinterpreted the last comment. So I think that that's at this point just a great reminder, and would love to hear further comment from you on how we incorporate that into our proposal.
Okay. Next question from John O'Hagan. Are you planning to combine efforts with the current CalGreen embodied carbon requirements or the material and buildings benchmarking being done by the Carbon Leadership Forum?
Yeah, so I just do want to address this to say that we are aware of many of the programs that exist that are kind of coincident with our program and are trying to develop a system that overlaps with those requirements to the extent that they would provide us information that that meets the standards that we're looking for. So hopefully we can minimize the necessity for additional information if it's not needed.
Okay, our next question from Ignacio Valdivia. To better understand your recommendations, you suggest using the US EEIO model, which relies on NAICS or NAICS codes to estimate embodied carbon in materials such as concrete, steel, and wood. This data would then be used to establish a state baseline. Could you elaborate on how this approach will drive embodied carbon reductions and what strategies CARB envisions to achieve meaningful emissions cuts?
Yeah, so I think that this comment pretty clearly cuts into the strategy development, which I'll reiterate is not the stage of the regulatory development or the program development that we're in right now. We're simply looking at developing the baseline to answer the question of what are the emissions in 2026, and also to establish the framework for reporting that we require folks to submit.
Okay. Our next comment is from Ruth Lehman. I appreciate the discussion, but as a reminder, CARB's work also includes non-building assets, such as transportation, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And as I said in answer to a comment a couple ago, we do have to keep in mind that there are overlapping requirements. Transportation, embodied carbon, they all kind of go together in order to reduce GHGs on a total statewide basis.
Our next comment, please accept my apologies if this question was already addressed in the presentation. I am curious to learn which building models you use to account for embodied carbon. Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe for this comment, if you want to have more information on the model that we're proposing, the US EEIO model for the baseline, please either reach out to us, or we do anticipate having further public engagement to get into the specifics of that topic.
Our next comment from Indranil Ganguly, a follow-up on the response on the cumulative 40% reduction that Jeff mentioned. So does this include phase B as well? If not, how will we reconcile the higher embodied carbon of a material that reduces the operational carbon along the way?
Yeah, once again, Indranil, this is delving into the strategy development, I think. If you don't think I'm right about that and you want to tie this question back specifically to the baseline, please, if you could do so in your written comments, that would be very appreciated.
Next comment is from Chayoung Hunt. Would the CARB baseline GWP limit align with the CalGreen baseline requirement?
Thank you, Chahyung. So the baseline that we're developing today, or introduced the concept of developing, is related to measuring the cumulative emissions that are occurring in California's building sector, let's say, in the 2026 year. So as far as GWP limits and requirements and how they would align with CalGreen, that's not being discussed during this reporting program development. That would be something more for the strategy, which will be coming in future years.
Our next question. There are many different pathways to make something like cement. How do you intend to disaggregate them? Will you establish baselines for each specific pathway?
Yeah, well, once again, this is, so the baseline is a total cumulative emissions number. So there's no disaggregation in the baseline itself. That's just one number. When it comes to considering different building materials or considering categories within building materials, that's another one where we're going to have to push off to the strategy development as far as what we would consider there.
Next question from Luke Lung. MEP, or mechanical, electrical, and plumbing components. Refrigerant can be a low-hanging fruit. Can we include the amount of refrigerant use and GWP in buildings? Even better if we can report refrigerant leakage, parentheses purchase, in each year.
Thanks for that, Luke. We do have specific programs covering refrigerant use and how we move forward with that in California currently. So probably the best thing we can do is link you to those programs and their websites for now.
Our next question, or a written comment from Zara Teshnizi. In parentheses, I missed part of the Q&A, so dismiss this question if you covered it. If EEIO model is used, is emissions from imported products are estimated based on US industry average emissions, or an average is estimated based on a ratio for local and imported materials or products?
Okay, I'm going to see if our if Dr. Kessler will be able to jump in on this one.
Yeah, so the US EIO model considers domestic production as well as non-domestic production from a US context. The non-domestic production, the emission factors and associated life cycle emissions with that comes from XEO base emission factors. So they are different. So imports do not end up with the same emission factors as what you might get for domestic or even in California production.
Okay, next question. I might have misunderstood Jeff's comments, but if you're including upstream life cycle emissions that went into the building materials, are those already accounted for in the emissions inventories for the states in which those upstream emissions occurred? Will that be reconciled to avoid double counting the emissions?
Jeff, I'll ask you if you have a quick answer for that. We can try to get that through that real quick.
Yeah. So quickly, I think the way to think of it is that the baseline associated with the building sector is a different inventory than what the state's greenhouse gas emissions inventory is. And so certainly there's different separations, different, I guess, boundaries that you're drawing around each. So they may include actually well, the state's inventory should include all emissions affiliated with building materials that are produced in the state, whereas the building sector emission would include the life cycle emissions, which would cover emissions also affiliated with materials from outside the state. So they're very different inventories, but there will be some differences in emissions, and a question on reconciliation is definitely something that we would love to hear your thoughts on more in a written comment, and if that is necessary and why.
Okay, so just to summarize, there are several comments that are fairly deep into the US EEIO model and how it works. So I just want to maybe say that those who have those sort of deep questions about that, to remind you that we do plan to have further engagement in the public arena about exactly how we would like to incorporate that into our baseline development based on all of your feedback. So if there's, some of those hopefully we'll be able to answer in that forum. Others, please feel free to reach out to us because I think some of these are going to require a further in-depth conversation. I think there's maybe one or two more questions we can answer, and then in respect of everybody's time, we're going to end this portion of the workshop so everybody can go out and get their lunch and whatnot.
Okay, well, thank you for your comments. and we will now take a break for lunch. Our workshop presentation will resume at 1 p.m. Pacific time. We look forward to seeing you then.
Folks know. Good afternoon. Welcome back, those who stayed with us and those who are rejoining. We're in the afternoon session of our workshop on embodied carbon. This morning, staff presented on concepts for baseline emissions modeling, which is a crucial component of any greenhouse gas reduction program. The baseline emissions model establishes a reference point for measuring emissions reductions and for developing strategies to achieve targeted reductions. For this session of the workshop, the CARB staff will review reporting requirements, which were outlined by California Code. Staff will also present initial concepts for reporting that meet the requirements for building material manufacturers and for covered projects. I'm going to pass the presentation over to Jeremy Loeb, who's going to discuss reporting requirements for manufacturers.
Thanks, Sanjira. So, statutory reporting requirements are detailed in 4 key subparts of the Health and Safety Code, section 38561.3. Under Health and Safety Code 38561.3, section C, construction projects must submit a life cycle assessment, or LCA, to CARB. LCAs are a means of evaluating and assessing the environmental impacts that are affiliated with a process or product, often encompassing the entire life cycle of that product, from raw material extraction to manufacturing, use, and end of life of that product. In addition to project reporting requirements, manufacturers must also provide environmental product declarations, also referred to as EPDs, or other similarly robust lifecycle data for the products they produce. EPDs are public disclosures of environmental impacts affiliated with specific construction products and are voluntarily being used by some companies today. Additionally, manufacturers must submit data to CARB to ensure that their products comply with any emissions reduction targets established by CARB at a future date. For the first part of this afternoon session, we'll begin by reviewing initial staff concepts for manufacturer reporting regulations. Health and Safety Code section 38561.3, subsection C2, calls for manufacturers of building materials to submit EPDs or similarly robust LCAs for products used in California. The one exception to this requirement is for appliances. One important consideration with this section of statute is to ensure that implementation minimizes emissions leakage or shuffling, and the same requirements apply to both in-state and out-of-state manufacturers selling into the California market. Staff is putting forward the initial concept to adopt a broad definition of building material manufacturer. Under this definition, all entities participating in the transfer or sale of building materials that are ultimately used in the state may be subject to regulation. In this definition, a building material manufacturer is defined as any firm which sells, supplies, offers for sale, or produces covered building materials for the use in the state of California. This definition would mean that any California-based entity in the supply chain for imported building products could be subject to relevant manufacturer reporting regulations, consistent with what in-state manufacturers might provide. Staff also recognizes that reporting could be expensive and difficult for many smaller building material manufacturers and small businesses. To that end, staff proposes to exempt entities under minimum annual revenue thresholds. Finally, staff suggests a definition to help interpret the appliance clause of 38561.3, section J. Under the provided definition, this language would exempt certain manufacturers from reporting. Specifically, this exemption would apply to manufacturers that produce only appliances, as defined by the California Energy Commission's Appliance Efficiency Regulations, found in Title 20, Part 6, Section 1601. Initial staff thinking around reporting requirements is that building material manufacturers or other obligated entities in the material supply chain are responsible for submitting the following data shown on this slide to CARB on a quarterly basis. This would include a list of all building material quantities and associated revenues produced by the facility and/or sold into California. Either facility-specific EPD data for each covered product or facility-level data that will allow CARB to calculate the emissions of that product using a similarly robust LCA approach. This diagram lays out the two potential reporting options for reporting building materials. These options will be discussed in more detail momentarily, but this slide helps to identify key decision points and information relevant for reporting entities. As discussed, there are two routes that a building material manufacturers or others in the supply chain with reporting obligations may utilize to satisfy the reporting requirements staff have outlined. Regardless of the submission route selected, whether it is the default requirement or the alternative compliance option, the reporting entity would be required to report product quantities and revenue information pertaining to products sold into California to CARB. The default reporting requirement is to generate and provide EPD data that meet specific data quality and transparency standards required by CARB. The alternative reporting compliance option would require submission of facility-specific data, including complete material and energy balances, to allow CARB to estimate carbon intensities for each product produced. Well, section 38561.3 suggests that EPDs may be used as the fundamental data source for assessing greenhouse gas emissions. Statute also allows CARB to evaluate other data sources that may provide better data for the purposes of assessing greenhouse gas emissions. We received numerous public comments from the previous workshop concerning EPD data quality. Staff recognize that there are concerns with current EPDs and that there may be significant challenges in using EPDs to establish a robust climate program. CARB has also shared concerns about EPDs with the US EPA as part of the federal Buy Clean program being considered in the previous administration. First, many products currently lack EPDs, which limits their ability to be used as a gold standard for all building materials. Current EPDs also have limited transparency, and the verification standards, data sources, and vintages of the data utilized are not sufficiently transparent or well-defined for use in compliance programs. EPDs can also include crediting or other voluntary offsets associated with specific emissions, which can further obfuscate the direct emissions tied to the production of a product. This can result in significantly lower emissions profiles due to bundling of environmental attributes like renewable energy certificates, which may be treated differently and may not be fungible across various jurisdictions or regulatory contexts. EPD system boundaries may also vary and are often limited to a cradle-to-gate scope, corresponding to stages A1 to A3, which often excludes significant emissions affiliated with construction practices, such as site preparation work and the use of heavy machinery. EPDs have highly variable data quality and vintages. For instance, an EPD released today may be valid for 5 years, thus expiring in 2030. The year of the primary data used to generate the EPD may be several years older than the issuance date for the EPD, and the background datasets used are often sourced from tools with significantly older data. Examples from current EPDs include the use of EcoInvent version 3.6, which was released in 2019. Further, the underlying data in these background data tools may be affiliated with even older historic data than the release date of that tool, which creates difficulty in assessing whether emission factors are still representative of contemporary supply chains, especially when accounting for ongoing emissions reduction efforts. Under current EPD standards, data from the 1990s could still be used to make claims about products produced in 2030. Additionally, emission factors used for upstream, Scope 3 calculations can be derived from a range of LCA sources, further impacting comparability of different EPDs and emissions or emissions reductions for regulatory purposes. To ensure that EPD data is sufficiently robust for use in a regulatory context, staff proposes to only accept EPD data that meet higher quality standards. This includes more recent data, disaggregating emissions calculations to ensure that environmental attributes are clearly delineated and specified, and standardizing the default Scope 3 emission factors used to generate EPDs. These requirements align with previous CARB feedback on recommended EPD standards, and also dovetail with ongoing efforts by the EPA to draft EPD criteria for data quality and transparency. Because not all building materials have EPDs, the cost associated with generating EPDs and that updating EPD data to CARB's proposed standards may take significant time to implement, CARB proposes an alternative compliance option of using facility-specific data to construct a similarly robust material lifecycle assessment. To perform this alternative LCA, CARB would collect information on the total greenhouse gas emissions at the facility. These data already exist for facilities that report to CARB's MRR program or the EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program. For manufacturing facilities that will be required to report to our program but are not currently reporting to these other programs, these facilities will need to independently calculate their direct greenhouse gas emissions using methods consistent with the calculation requirements defined in MRR and the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. All facilities that are reporting their facility-specific information will also be required to attest to the veracity of the information they've provided, and that the calculations have been done in accordance with the methods defined under MRR and the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. Additionally, reporting entities may be subject to audits if requested by CARB or a designated third party. If requested, reporting entities would need to provide records to facilitate review of the underlying information and calculations used to estimate facility-specific emissions. CARB can estimate indirect emissions, such as upstream Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, associated with each facility through use of standardized emission factors and the complete material and energy balances around the facility. These material and energy balances must clearly delineate commodity inputs, outputs, and quantities. Finally, CARB would allocate total direct and indirect emissions across various product streams using facility-specific production and revenue data. This process would result in a carbon intensity value for each product manufactured at the facility. Those carbon intensities could then be multiplied by the total quantities of products sold into California to calculate the total emissions attributed to that facility. Staff anticipates that some subsectors that do not currently engage in state or federal BioClean programs may lack extensive EPD catalogs. These entities may face significant costs to develop reporting capabilities within the timeframes staff has proposed for reporting. To reduce costs for building material manufacturers that are not currently covered under different BioClean programs, staff are outlining an option to phase in manufacturer reporting requirements. Phase 1 reporting is targeting material manufacturing sectors that have a sizable impact on overall embodied carbon emissions. This initial phase would include reporting for cement and concrete, iron, steel, and ferroalloy products, glass and glass products, asphalt, pavement and shingles, insulation, and wood products. All of these materials are key building materials used in a variety of building structures. These materials account for a prominent share of the overall expected embodied carbon emissions associated with building material use in California. There are other sectors that also contribute significantly to emissions that should start reporting information to CARB after the initial priority phase. This next phase-in for manufacturer reporting would occur in 2028, where additional sectors that contribute significantly to emissions would be required to report. Staff are seeking feedback to understand if the proposed timeframes are achievable for these sectors, and if there are other priority sectors that should be included in either phase 1 or phase 2. This concludes the section on manufacturer reporting. So we've already covered a lot of ground today, and staff are eager to receive feedback on all of the topics we've discussed so far. We want to highlight a few specific questions on which staff are hoping to receive public comments. We will have another public comment period at the end of this next and final section of the staff presentation. In addition to verbal comments offered today, we do want to remind everyone that CARB will open a 30-day public comment period following this workshop to submit written comments. You will be able to find more information and a link on the comment submission on our website following today's meeting. Written public comments are a critical piece of the regulatory development process, and we appreciate everyone's time and expertise. So, first, how should the agency approach data collection for manufacturers and downstream supply chain entities? This includes considerations for reporting from resale, retail, and wholesale entities to better facilitate chain of custody tracking for products. Additionally, what annual revenue thresholds should be considered for exemption for manufacturer reporting? Staff is also seeking feedback on concepts presented for the data reporting regulations. Are there specific concerns, and how should staff address those concerns? When it comes to data reporting, how long do manufacturers expect it to take to meet any or all proposed EPD data submittal requirements discussed today? This includes significant changes to background and primary data vintages, as well as emission factors and tools used for background data. Staff presented an alternative reporting approach to EPD data submission. Is this approach desirable for manufacturers and other relevant entities in the supply chain? In addition, staff presented a phase-in concept for reporting requirements. Do manufacturers have concerns about reporting timelines and phase-in approaches outlined in this presentation? How should staff better address these concerns? Finally, what other programs administered by the state should be leveraged for reporting needs under this program? And how should these data be utilized? This may include programs like MRR, SB 253, and others. As I mentioned, we will have another public comment period at the end of this workshop presentation and welcome your feedback. I will now pass the presentation over to Dr. Emily Gahagan, who will discuss our initial concepts on reporting requirements for covered projects.
Thanks, Jeremy. My name is Emily Gahagan, and I'm an air pollution specialist working on embodied carbon at CARB. The final section of this workshop covers initial staff concepts on project reporting regulations. There are very specific statutory reporting requirements that apply to covered projects. These requirements are detailed in Health and Safety Code Section 38561.3C1. Importantly, this section of the Health and Safety Code requires covered projects to submit a life cycle assessment to determine the carbon intensity of materials used in new residential and non-residential buildings. Additionally, requires reporting from projects with 5 or more residential units or more than 10,000 square feet of non-residential space. Additionally, the Health and Safety Code has key provisions related to cost containment and unfeasibility when it comes to incorporating low carbon building materials. We'll go over these specific requirements in more detail in the next several slides. It's important to understand what entities will be ultimately reporting data to CARB. By default, Health and Safety Code Section 38561.6A5 designates the default reporting entity as the real property owner. However, Section 38561.3G allows delegation of that responsibility. Staff suggests that eligible architects, engineers, or contractors with responsibility for the certification of installation, which tends to have direct control over the project design documents, can be delegated as the responsible entity for reporting project-specific information to CARB. Health and Safety Code Section 38561.3C1 requires any project with at least 5 new residential units to report. However, statutory language doesn't clarify the terms for what 5 new residential units means. Language in statute is ambiguous as to whether the construction of multiple single-family homes in a subdivision would count as separate projects or as a single project. To improve clarity, staff have provided the following definition. Under this definition for covered residential projects, a project is the construction of 5 or more residential units by the same project owner within a single building or single land subdivision map submitted pursuant to California Government Code Section 66426. Under this definition, construction of 5 or more residences whether in a single building or multiple buildings, within a single subdivision map submittal will count as a single project and therefore be required to report. On the right, you'll see a diagram that illustrates this concept. This image is a subdivision map that contains 28 single-family house lots, or under this definition, 28 units within one covered project. Health and Safety Code Section 38561.3C1 also requires any non-residential project with a minimum size of 10,000 square feet to report. However, statute has not defined the specific types of projects that qualify as non-residential. To improve clarity, staff suggests that definitions listed in Title 24 may be appropriate. This would define non-residential buildings to include all occupiable buildings listed in Title 24, Part 2, Section 302, except for residential group R. This covers commercial, institutional, and industrial buildings, but excludes infrastructure. Staff are seeking feedback on this scope. For example, are there other projects outside this scope that should be included? Health and Safety Code Section 38561.3C1 requires all covered residential and non-residential projects to submit a life cycle assessment, as defined in the International Organization for Standardization 14040 series of standards, with a focus on the product stage phases A1 through A3. Staff have provided a concept for implementing this requirement through the use of a phased-in compliance tier. The basic reporting tier applies to all projects and establishes the core set of data required to estimate a carbon intensity score for a project. This basic reporting tier also provides some projects the option to submit an additional verified whole building LCA in lieu of having CARB assign a carbon intensity score to the project. Larger projects, however, are also responsible for complying with the whole building LCA reporting requirements. Under the whole building LCA reporting track, the project must submit a whole building life cycle assessment, which calculates the building's life cycle emissions from material production and building construction, A stage, through building use and maintenance, B stage, to building deconstruction, or C stage. To reduce whole building LCA costs for smaller projects, staff are presenting the concept that larger projects will be required to submit whole building LCAs once the reporting regulation is adopted, and that over time, whole building LCA submittal will become mandatory for more projects. For basic reporting, staff propose to collect general project information to identify projects and evaluate project costs, including building size, costs, location, project contacts, as well as a complete bill of materials. This information can be used to estimate the project's total emissions and carbon intensity to fulfill the requirement that all projects submit a life cycle analysis. Staff intend to release draft reporting templates in the near future and are looking at additional public engagement, including potential future technical meetings with interested parties to discuss the reporting templates. Please get in touch with staff if you have further comment or are interested in participating in any future technical meetings. For larger projects, the initial staff concept is that these larger projects are required to submit a whole building LCA in addition to the basic reporting requirements. Initially, staff think that this whole building LCA requirement could only apply to projects greater than 30 residential units or greater than 100,000 square feet of non-residential building space. Staff notes that this criteria for non-residential projects also aligns with the recent update to Cal Green Building Code Section 5.409.2 that calls for a cradle-to-grave whole building LCA for projects of 100,000 square feet or greater. Our thinking around the whole building LCA requirements is that this analysis should include the following. First, a cradle-to-grave system boundary that includes all operational emissions. The statute explicitly mentions stages A1 through A3 of a product's life cycle assessment. These stages are important to focus on because a significant fraction of a product's life cycle emissions typically come from these manufacturing stages. However, there are numerous other stages that are equally important contributors to product greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions associated with product life cycle stages A1 through A3 are emissions that projects, including designers and other construction firms, have little ability to reduce. These emissions are directly tied to manufacturing processes and are less impacted by decisions made by individual construction projects in California. On the other hand, product stages A5 and C stages are tied to on-site construction emissions and decisions about reuse and disposal of materials. These emissions are more influenced by decisions that designers and the construction industry can make about their projects. Therefore, for project reporting, an LCA that can capture design choices, construction considerations, and material or structure reuse choices is likely better to show how projects are working to reduce emissions. Second, there will be the inclusion of all major building elements, such as structural elements, envelope, interior finishes, hardscaping, and walls. Third, a consistent 60-year reference study period. And finally, use of identified methodologies and standards for applying life cycle inventory data. This concludes our project reporting presentation. Staff are requesting feedback on several topics. This includes whether the initial concept for delegation of reporting is desirable, what concerns are there with the initial concept presented for inclusion considerations for residential and non-residential projects, identification of challenges and barriers to project reporting, especially for producing whole building LCAs, any impacts on the cost, timeline, or feasibility of projects from the proposed reporting requirements, any issues or challenges with reporting for specific building types, at what stage of the project schedule should covered projects report, and finally, whole building LCA standards and methodologies that should be considered. And I will now pass the presentation back to Dr. Ambrose for the public comment period and concluding remarks.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Jeremy, as well, for those excellent presentations. Once again, we're going to have a public comment period. We look forward to answering questions again. For the public comment process, CARB staff will be relying on the raised hand feature of Zoom. So if you have a question, please use the raise hand feature in the Zoom toolbar. When staff call on your name, please unmute yourself by clicking the red button that appears in a pop-up box when you're called upon, and proceed to introduce yourself and any affiliations you may hold. If you're a phone attendee, please dial *9 to raise your hand or lower your hand, and when your phone number is called, please dial *6 to mute or unmute yourself prior to speaking. If you prefer to submit a written comment or question, you can use the Q&A feature. There's a Q&A button located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Written comments and questions that will be answered today as well after spoken comments. So we will keep the workshop open, obviously, until the end of our time here to answer any questions that are raised, and we'll do our best to address all comments. And I just want to remind everyone that there will be a written comment period, which is open, and we obviously encourage all interested parties to please provide written comments through the public comment docket. Perfect. Okay. I see we have a couple of hands up. I'm going to go ahead and start on public comments, and then we will also be answering comments from the Q&A as well. We're going to start with Robert Raymer. Robert Raymer, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Please introduce yourself and any affiliations you hold.
Yes, this is Bob Raymer. I'm representing the California Building Industry Association, the California Apartment Association, Building Owners and Managers Association, and the Business Properties Association. And this is just a question or a comment related to AB 2446. I've been very familiar with the drafting and adoption of the green building standards for many years now. And one of the issues that came up during the last triennial adoption of Cal Green was whether or not the Building Standards Commission, who's doing this for commercial buildings, is using the same criteria for determining what is significant cost impact and what is considered feasible that ARB must use under that. So if you could sort of comment on that, we're trying to see the connection here or whatever. And of course, we feel it would be great if everybody's using the same definition. So that's my sort of question right now. And we'll submit written comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that comment. Yes, we do realize that the cost and feasibility provision in the statute, but that will come like after we in the strategy development phase, like we mentioned in the earlier session. This workshop is currently focused on the reporting regulation and the baseline, and please stay tuned when we are moving towards the strategy development phase of our regulation. Thank you, and then we look forward to receive your written comments.
Thank you.
We have our next commenter, Scott Farbman. Scott, please go ahead and introduce yourself. Oh, appears we lost the line there. We have Scott has his hand back up here. So Scott Farbman was next. I'm going to go ahead and let yourself unmute. Please introduce yourself again.
Sorry, dropped my hand too quick there. Got ahead of myself. Scott Farbman with Energy Solutions. Wanted to just provide some perspective to one or two of the questions in the request for feedback, and it does build on some of the commentary from the first half of the presentation around. I seem to recall a gentleman speaking to building systems and how important it is to provide data per building system. And when I think building system, I think structural system, facade system, interiors, MEP, etc. And I think if there isn't a well-defined system boundary, for example, like which systems should reporting include, you're going to end up with a lot of discrepancy in numbers, if you're trying to normalize to per square foot or whatever it is, it's going to be really, really tricky. So I guess my comment is, what's the plan? Or my question is, what's CARB's plan for assessing which building systems should be included in the reporting, and then just to build on that slightly, there are certain systems that don't quite have the level of EPDs quite yet on the market to even provide a good takeoff. So for example, the MEP systems, not a lot of EPD availability in North America for a lot of the components and equipment. So I'm just curious, there's going to be a lot of discrepancy. Kind of what's the plan to try and normalize that? Thank you.
Thank you for that comment and your concern. I think in the staff presentation we have outlined. I'm not sure what you refer to here as system, but we did outline some of the basic staff initial concepts of the reporting requirements. For example, for the project, right, we have the basic reporting where you submit all the build materials of the building project, and also for larger projects, we have some initial thinking of the whole building life cycle analysis boundary, from cradle to grave, inclusive operational emissions. And in terms of, EPD data, we do acknowledge the current challenges, and we have outlined some specific CARB requirements for EPD data and alternative compliance pathway for facility reporting. And if any other questions about what we have proposed here, please feel free to reach out to us later or submit written comments so we can further clarify.
Yeah, I think just so when I say boundaries for building systems. I mean, if one building submits data with their MEP assumptions included and one building doesn't, then you're going to have a pretty big discrepancy there. So is there going to be a planned standardization for which building materials CARB will want to see in reporting?
Yes, we're
Yeah.
definitely working on the more detailed requirements on what kind of building materials will be covered in the reporting, and we will hold more technical meetings in the future where we outline the specific reporting templates. So please stay tuned for further
Okay.
engagement.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Casey Wander, we have you next. Please, you may unmute yourself.
Hi, Casey Wander with the University of California. In terms of implementing the whole building life cycle assessment requirement, has CARB made any efforts to align the requirements with LEED? Since most of our projects that would be doing this would also be achieving LEED certification or attempting, it would be a lot easier for building owners for the requirements to be aligned with LEED, especially where it comes to the system boundaries. I think someone mentioned earlier it would be stages A through C, which I think is a broader requirement than LEED v4 or LEED v5 right now. So if there's any attempts to make it more aligned with one of the LEED versions, I think that would make it easier to implement for many building owners.
Thank you, Casey, for the comment. And we did refer to quite a few existing programs when we design our whole building lifecycle analysis. We do realize that we have a broader scope in the current proposal, include A to C and operational emissions. That's because I think there is like interplay between operational and embodied carbon emissions, and to gather information at the project level can help us further evaluate the embodied carbon reductions happening at the project stage. And if there's any like concerns or issues, like challenges in meeting our proposed scope, please do let us know and would like to follow up.
Okay, I think what we'll do is probably talk to some of our design teams about the feasibility of implementing this and then respond in writing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Casey. Nick, we have you next in the queue. You may unmute yourself. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I have 4 questions-ish. And I don't know if you want me to give you all the questions first, or do you want to take them one by one?
We can do one by one.
Sure. I guess the first question I have is, could you explain in a little greater detail what the difference is between just a regular LCA and a whole building LCA?
Hanju, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, in statute, you can see that there's clearly language pertaining to covered projects submitting an LCA. And we're using that term whole building LCA in part because we think that that is a term that is well recognized within the industry as an assessment framework. I think that if you have comments on why that would or would not be an appropriate use or term to describe the statutory requirements or what's proposed, we'd obviously be interested in hearing that feedback.
Yeah, it wasn't that I had an objection to it. I just wanted to understand it better. I know that you had given 2 alternatives. One made it sound like that CARB would provide some data for that. I think the regular LCA, like based on some default standards. And then on the whole building LCA, it seemed like it was different from that. And I'm just wondering, how do you treat the products for which there aren't any EPDs?
I think these are great comments and questions, and ones that I think we're interested in hearing more about from stakeholder or from interested parties. as well as having some opportunities to have deeper dives into these technical concepts in the future. I think what we articulated in the work, what we tried to articulate in the workshop today, what you heard presenters discuss, were that we would have two pathways or options, alternatives for reporting for covered projects. As I mentioned, statute clearly requires covered projects to submit the results of an LCA and, as we're calling, whole building LCA. But we are aware that producing an LCA could be a barrier for some projects, including a cost barrier or a cost burden. And the alternative compliance mechanism or pathway that was presented today through basic reporting is essentially an alternative to submitting the LCA.
Okay, a different question. In one of the slides, you indicated you'd be looking for project costs. And I anticipate some of our folks wondering about privacy concerns regarding that and disclosure to the public or to competitors.
Yeah.
And what sort of protection would they have from that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nick. So CARP currently we run quite a few very successful programs that require like reporting of confidential business information or other like market sensitive data. So we have a set of procedures and policies to ensure your data is protected. And if you want to know more about the general data privacy policy for CARP and also our procedure in terms of any public act request in terms of confidential data, I think we have quite a few resources posted online, and we would love to talk to you too if you still have any concerns about the data confidentiality.
Okay, and then what I hope is my last question, you had asked when in the process it might be good to provide this, and I'm saying this just based on what appears to make sense to me, that perhaps the certificate of occupancy towards the end, if you're asking for cost data, or even the types of products that you use, if anything changes during the construction process, that might be the most accurate time to get the information.
Great. We appreciate the feedback, and I really appreciate you can submit some written comments for us to consider later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anika Sal, you are the next folk with your hand up. Please, you may unmute yourself and offer your comment, and please identify your affiliation.
Hi, I'm Annika Sial with the San Francisco Environment Department. Thank you so much for the thorough presentations and the thought that you all are putting into this. It was really great to hear about what you've been thinking about in regards to the cradle to grave whole building LCA framework. And I wanted to provide some additional considerations about this approach, specifically that it's really critical that the whole building LCA methodology and baseline modeling includes a specific methodology for assessing the carbon intensity of reclaimed materials that values their carbon impact depending on the system boundaries. So what I mean by that is that we really need a specific methodology enumerated to effectively assess number one, the carbon intensity of reclaimed materials, considering that there isn't really a strong base for EPDs among those product categories, and the fact that reuse facilities are generally small and local businesses for whom it's going to be more challenging to generate EPDs or even comply with alternative LCA methodologies. So it could be really a major burden for these stakeholders to create that data. It's also really important to determine how the global warming potential reductions associated with materials reuse should be allocated between systems. So there is a material recoverer, there's also a reuser, then there's someone who might be designing a building with disassembly in mind. So how are we going to account for the sharing of carbon impacts across these different projects? We also don't really currently have reliable data on reclaimed material sales and reintegration because tracking material intake is not super common among reuse facilities and retailers. So I think that chain of custody tracking would probably require a more in-depth material passport approach, which would require its own dedicated funding and implementation strategy. Yeah, so a lot of details, but essentially this is all to say that it's really important to do some dedicated and specific thought around the reintegration of reclaimed materials to ensure that they're not disincentivized in these methodologies. So I did want to ask if you have a plan to ensure that there's a standardized way to account for these materials that does adequately value their carbon impact across system boundaries. And if not, highly recommend that you dedicate some time and effort to doing so.
Great. Thank you, Annika, for that really thoughtful and detailed suggestion and response. So for the reclaimed reused materials, I think we are kind of working on some more of the detailed reporting requirements, and we'll appreciate to hear more of your experience and suggestion on this. Seems like you have a lot of detailed experience and also feedback on this. Please submit written comments, and we'd love to talk to you later. And when we have like a more fleshed out, detailed reporting requirements. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start turning to some of the questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to raise your hand. We will come back to the raised hands if you have your hand up. But for the moment, I think we're going to take some of these questions out of the Q&A. I'm going to start with a question from a Frank Pasker. What will be the projected impact on the already high construction cost in California when the system is being implemented?
Greg, thanks for the question and concern. So we have a set of the alternative compliance in place and also phasing approach in place. And we're also working with existing programs, hoping to leverage some of the existing program to further reduce costs. And we would love for you to share any of the cost of data or concerns with our current proposed reporting requirements. So if you can let us know, we'll do further cost analysis. And as part of the rulemaking process, we will be publishing any cost impact analysis along with our staff report for more detailed analysis. So please share us with any of the data and concerns you have. Thank you.
Great. I also have a question here from a Maya Tour. Please provide guidelines for how the HSC, the Health and Safety Code, requiring environmental product declarations would or would not apply to salvaged building materials. This could encourage or discourage material reuse.
Thanks, Maya, for that question. So currently, we do require reporting for all building materials in the state of California, and we will be following up with more detailed guidance on the specifics of the covered materials.
Okay. I'm going to keep going here with some of the questions from the Q&A. We have a question here from Derek Harlow. Why must they be facility-specific environmental product declarations? What if the product category rule states that a product-specific environmental product declaration that is averaged when plant manufacturing data is less than 10% different in results? So a question here related to some of the proposed EPD data or submittal requirements.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Derek. So we are asking facility level data because the most granular data we can have, so we can have some specific direct emission and also Scope 3 emissions associated with each facility. And as we outlined in our presentation, we do give some additional requirements for the current EPD data. That's probably in addition to the current PCRs. And if you have any concerns or any challenges associated with the facility-specific EPD data or facility-specific data, please do follow up and let us know.
Apologies. Proceeding here, I'm going to put another question up from our Q&A. This is from Lucy Featherstone. Are there any softwares that CARB recommends using to begin tracking this data necessary for reporting?
So as CARB, we do not endorse any external tools, data. So please follow up with us if you have any questions on how you can approach the tracking the data. We can probably give you some guidance later. Thanks.
Additionally, I think we are interested in learning more from those, potentially regulated entities or reporting entities about the current tools or systems that they use for tracking EPD type data or LCA outputs related to whole buildings. Additionally, CARB will be developing a reporting system to allow reporting entities to report their data directly to CARB. Through that development process, which will be public. We're obviously very interested in learning more about what potential existing systems regulated or reporting entities might be using, so that we can design a reporting system that is as accessible and easy to use as possible.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, Hanji. And I almost forgot to mention, we do actually have 2 existing public surveys on our website that helps us to understand current industry best practices or we are already using to track data or any existing data format you have. So that could really help us design our reporting system and regulation. We would highly encourage you to take that survey if you haven't. And we did receive some responses, and we thank everyone who has provided survey responses to us.
Excellent. I'll keep moving here through some of the Q&A questions. The next one here from Mercy Merdiaga. When do project reporting regulations for non-residential projects become in effect? And how are CARB regulations for non-residential different or similar to the current CalGreen embodied carbon regulations?
Thanks for that question. So according to the statute, we have to finish development of our reporting framework and regulation by December 31st, 2026. And I guess your second question is, how do CARB regulation similar to or different to Calgary? I think we do have the 10,000 square feet for the non-residential that's outlined in the statute, and we did propose like 100,000 square foot for larger projects to meet the whole building life cycle analysis requirements in 2026, 2027-ish. So that is aligned with Calgary requirement, but the 10,000 square foot statutory mandatory square footage for the non-residential building is a little bit more stringent than the Calgary requirements.
And I just jump in a little bit to say that, at this point, CARB is in the process of developing a reporting regulation pursuant to statute. So these are concepts that we presented today for a potential reporting regulation. And if you have more comments on how these reporting requirements should or could align with the existing CalGreen requirements, that is obviously comments that we would be very interested in receiving. And just to acknowledge as well that we are working with our sister agencies, including the Building Standards Commission, the Division of the State Architect, Department of General Services, and the Department of Housing and Community Development on the current intervening code cycle updates. So we are looking and we are participating actively with those agencies in discussion on updates in this cycle to CalGreen requirements. So please, though, if you have more feedback on that, we appreciate your written comments. I'll jump down to this next a comment from an anonymous attendee. Will CARB reporting requirements for whole building life cycle assessment on large projects be aligned with whole building life cycle assessment reporting options in CalGreen? So once again, a question about alignment with CalGreen?
Yeah. Yeah, I think hopefully we already addressed this question in the previous comment. Like Hanji mentioned, we have been working with CalGreen. We initiated conversation and we are working with CalGreen and other sister agencies outlined in our statute closely. And we're trying to align our whole building lifecycle assessment analysis requirements as best as we can. So yeah, hope that addressed your question.
Great. Okay, so I have another question here from Elisa Podesto. What is the rationale behind asking for project cost information? It doesn't appear that construction costs are directly relevant to CARB's mandate.
Thank you, Lisa, for that question. I think because there's a cost provision in our statute, so I think it's important for us to understand the project cost information at this point for any of our future strategy development. If you have any concerns in sharing the data, like we mentioned before, we have a whole suite of procedures and policies to protect the cost and other confidential data for projects.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to keep... Oh, I see we have one hand up, but I'm going to just take one more question out of the Q&A and then we'll come back to the hands up. This is from a Samuel Bent. When will the construction project recording requirements take effect?
I think we probably have addressed that before too. So the statute says that by 2026, December 31, we need to develop the reporting framework. So I will assume the reporting requirements will happen around 2026 or 2027 timeframe.
I see that Nick has his hand up again. Nick, I'm going to go ahead and call on you. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Sure. Thanks for indulging me again. That last comment or question one or two ago reminded me, and this is not a concern or a complaint about asking for the costs associated with doing in the reporting portion, but just to point out that the statute does, when it comes to cost impact, it does say that it can increase the cost by more than 5% according to not the baseline, but to what the cost would be if this law weren't in effect, if this law didn't apply to the project. Again, not a complaint about collecting the cost, information that you're asking for, but I just wanted to point out that when it comes to, when eventually we're operating under the system, that'll be the key factor.
Yeah, thanks for that comment.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I think we agree that collecting the cost data is an important component related to assessing that feasibility requirement. Okay, we're going to keep going here with some comments in the Q&A. I'm going to go down here to Ignacio Valdivia. Health and Safety Code 38561.3 states that the requirement to incorporate low carbon materials must be limited or excluded if it results in a significant cost impact. So once again, so how is CARB going to define cost impact, and will there be financial or technical support for smaller manufacturers and rural producers to help offset the costs of compliance with EPD and LCA requirements?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we did, in our initial staff presentation, we did propose some concepts for potential exemptions for smaller revenue manufacturers, and we are seeking public comments and feedback on what that threshold should be. And we did also outline some alternative compliance approach. So hopefully that can help reduce the cost affiliated with reporting. And if you have any other suggestions how we can further reduce the cost for manufacturer reporting, we would really want to hear from you. And also the cost impact, I think that phrase is mostly focused on project reporting from the statute, just to clarify that.
I'm going to go ahead and jump down to an anonymous attendee's question here in the Q&A. What is city government's role when it comes to ensuring local manufacturers, residential, non-residential properties conform with CARB's regulation?
Sorry, I don't see. Okay, let me see. What is that? So thanks for that question. Let's see. City government's role when it comes to ensuring to conform. So I don't know how to do to jump on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think, we're very interested in learning more about, perspectives from project developers or those undertaking new construction projects on how reporting is going to intersect with the existing building life cycle. We understand that there are a number of existing milestones that occur between a planning phase of a project and the completion of that project or awarding of a certificate of occupancy. And so there's different permitting obligations and inspections, as well as certifications or issuances and documentation that occur during that project's life cycle. And those milestones often involve municipal governments and permitting issue authorities. So I think it's very something that we're thinking about, and we're interested in hearing more perspectives on how CARB reporting can interact with or time with those existing project milestones. We've brought up a couple of concepts today related to the timing of project reporting and definitional project reporting, which related to both the planning permit phase and the municipal building permit issuance. So I encourage you to look back at those questions in the slides and provide any written comments, or feel free to reach out to us to discuss more about perspectives on how this potential reporting regulation could intersect with actions that cities are taking in regards to buildings. Okay, I can keep going on the Q&A here. We have a Q&A question here from Scott Farbman about how does CARB anticipate sharing the reporting data results? So I believe speaking about the data that is actually reported through this regulation.
Right. Thanks, Scott, for that question. So we will be collecting the reporting data after reporting regulations are live. We anticipate we'll probably share the data in some format. We haven't really figured out what kind of format that would be, but I think in some sort of form we will be letting people know what kind of information we have learned from the reporting data.
I think, obviously, as we spoke about earlier too, that some reporting data might be confidential business information or other types of confidential information that we would that we as an agency are obviously going to be especially minded towards. So I think while we are always going to try and develop ways to report out our tracking towards achieving our eventual target for the regulation, I think it's going to be balanced with the need to protect confidential business information from reporting entities. Apologies if my volume dipped down there. I will try to make sure I maintain. Okay, I'm going to move down here to a Maya tour. I think this is just a comment regarding that facility-specific data would allow designers to select products with lowest GWP, and industry-wide environmental product declarations is much less useful. I think we're obviously very interested to hear more feedback on the strengths and limitations of the current state of environmental product declarations in the market. So thank you for that comment. I can go down here to Jordan Palmieri. Jordan has a comment. Does cost impact definition in statute apply to the reporting regulations, or does the cost impact only apply to products and projects complying with future target reductions in the comprehensive strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Jordan, for that question. So in the statute, it did mention the cost impact is related to incorporating the lower carbon material in a project. So I think that means that it's associated with the future target reductions in the comprehensive strategy, like when we actually start incorporating the lower carbon material. Hope that clarifies the question.
Great. I see another comment from an anonymous attendee that's it's sort of similar to a comment we just received about CARB giving more specific data on embodied carbon at city or county levels as a result of this work. Because we want to encourage, or the commenter states that they want to encourage local manufacturing. Having this data could be helpful because most data is not very specific to a location. I think as perhaps Lex wanted to jump in.
I'm sorry, no, I'm just helping to manage your.
Oh, thank you very much. You know, I was just going to say to this that this is a great another comment that we really appreciate. I think, you know, these are we appreciate hearing this comment in this forum. Obviously, we appreciate written comments in the docket, but I think this is a great specific comment that we can think about on what are important data that could be shared out. And potentially, benefits for other jurisdictions or municipalities in the state that are looking to this work for data. So I think that's a very useful comment. Thank you. Okay, I guess we have a comment here from Mario Andrade. Will EPDs be required to be issued by an accredited certification body? I didn't hear anything about that. Could you please clarify? Sure. We spoke a little bit about the challenges that we see in the current state of EPDs or environmental product declarations in the market. Some of those challenges or limitations included a lack of availability across different products, as well as a lack of consistency in accounting and accounting frameworks or rules. And so I think what we suggested in today's proposal or in today's presentation, I think what we heard staff present was pathways for collecting EPD type data, and that would include either facility level reporting data or the types of data that we see in that come out of LCAs that underpin EPDs. So I think we'd very much be interested in hearing more about the need for accreditation or challenges perhaps or in current accreditation schemes. I think that the approach that the agency is going to take is clearly going to have to look at what is the best available data for this to answer or address some of these statutory requirements. Okay. Ignacio Valdivia also has has a question here in the chat, and it's related to the phase-in that was articulated today during the presentation. For the 2026 phase-in, will manufacturers be required to have EPD, Environmental Product Declaration certified plants by the start of the reporting period? Or will there be a transition period time to certify facilities? Additionally, how is CARB considering the challenges faced by smaller producers or those in rural areas who may not have the resources to generate facility-specific environmental product declarations quickly? Will there be alternative compliance pathways or support mechanisms to ensure fair practices?
Yeah. Thanks for that comment and question. So in our staff presentation, we did outline a phasing period for different kind of manufactured building materials. That is a set of key building materials that will be required to report in starting 2026, and some other materials we're phasing later. And we did mention some potential revenue exemption for smaller revenue manufacturers, and also provided alternative compliance pathway for facility-specific data instead of facility-specific EPD because of the cost of generating EPD data. Yeah, so if you have any other suggestions than what we have outlined in our presentation, please do feel free to reach out and share any of your comments and feedback with us.
Okay, we have a hand up from the attendees by Charlie Ray. Charlie, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Please introduce yourself and any affiliation you hold.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I accidentally hit the button.
That's okay.
Yeah.
So no question. All right.
Yeah, I'm fine at this.
Excellent. We'll go ahead and go back. We do have another question in the Q&A. This question from Lisa Podesto about the is actually a comment, I think, in response to the question earlier about construction costs. Thank you very much for that comment, Lisa. We appreciate that. We'll definitely take that into consideration. Okay. Don't see any other comments or questions at this moment in the Q&A or hands up amongst attendees. We're going to keep the comment period open here. We're not for just another moment. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in. We have a few more slides to wrap up the day just to talk about our timeline and next steps, which we'll probably turn to a moment, and then we can come back for questions as time allows. Great. Okay. So we appreciate very much all the comments and feedback that we heard today. Thank you to everyone who was able to participate in the morning and the afternoon session. As I mentioned previously, we invite you all to submit written any additional comments in writing through the public docket. Information to submit comments can be found on our Embodied Carbon website pretty easily from the homepage. So we very much appreciate the time it takes to craft those written comments. We do review them and use them quite extensively. Thank you very much. In addition, staff will be developing a frequently asked questions document with responses to many of the questions that we received today, as well as additional questions submitted during our prior workshop and potentially this workshop. And we'll be posting that hopefully on our website in the coming weeks. So please stay tuned and visit the website to find updates. CARB staff anticipate holding at least 2 technical meetings over the next several months to further engage with interested parties and to provide additional opportunities for feedback on the technical work staff is undertaking to develop and implement this important program. So just before we close, I want to go over the expected timeline for development of the reporting regulation. So to recap, this is the second workshop in a series to establish embodied carbon reporting regulation and baseline methodology. Staff are targeting completion of the embodied carbon reporting regulation by the end of this year, with mandatory reporting commencing in 2026. The next regulatory deadline is to finalize a comprehensive reduction strategy by 2028 and to achieve a 40% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for building materials by 2035. Staff have presented today several core concepts regarding the development of a model of baseline emissions for the state's building sector, as well as concepts on reporting requirements for building material manufacturers and covered new construction projects. We hope that you will help shape the regulatory development. And to that end, CARB encourages you, once again, to submit written comments about anything you've heard today to our public docket. And as well, please sign up and stay tuned for additional information regarding future public engagement.